It is easy to imagine the medieval world through the lens of castles and kings, knights in shining armor, and grand battles fought for glory. But the truth of survival during this time was far from romantic. The landscape itself was a battleground. Vast stretches of farmland lay barren, ravaged by the whims of weather and neglect. Fields once rich with crops were abandoned, victims of constant warfare, famine, and disease. What remained were haunting echoes of a time when survival was a fight that began the moment the sun rose. Beyond the horizon of these farmlands, cities and villages fell prey to the ravages of disease. Plague-ridden towns, where the stench of death lingered in the air, became prisons for the unfortunate souls trapped within their borders. Imagine a place where the slightest misstep, a sneeze, a cough, could be the end of everything. The plague would sweep through, leaving entire communities empty, with only the survivors left to pick up the pieces, often without the luxury of time or resources to recover. Life was never secure in medieval times. Outside the walls of the few protected strongholds, the common people faced constant threats. The ever-present danger of invasion loomed over every settlement. Villages could be reduced to rubble by marauding invaders in a matter of hours. And for the peasants who lived in them, survival was not just about enduring the elements, but about preparing for the worst that mankind had to offer. And yet, the most brutal of all divides was not just between the natural world and the medieval inhabitants, but between the classes themselves. The nobility and the clergy lived lives of relative comfort, their castles towering above the common folk below. The peasants, however, had little more than the ground beneath their feet, which was often more hostile than the people who walked on it. Survival for them was an endless struggle, one where the richest could offer only a fleeting glimpse of a better life, while the rest had to scrape, scrounge, and fight just to make it to the next day. What if everything we've been told about the Dark Ages was wrong? What if survival wasn't about thriving, but about simply enduring living with the constant knowledge that at any moment, everything you worked for could be taken away? What if the real story is far darker and more complex than the image of knights in shining armor we've been led to believe? The medieval world was unforgiving, yet beneath the surface of this unyielding environment, there was something else, something that allowed people to survive. This struggle was not simply one of physical endurance. It required knowledge, hidden knowledge. Survival, in this time, was about mastering the elements and understanding the complexities of an ancient world, filled with secrets, techniques, and practices that would never make it into the history books. This was a world not just of famine and disease, but of forgotten survival tactics that transcended the everyday. The skills that ensured survival for the peasant class were never written down, never celebrated, and often hidden from the prying eyes of those in power. But what if these forgotten heroes, those who lived on the fringes of society, knew something that could have changed everything? The harsh reality of medieval life wasn't just about surviving the world around you. It was about navigating the ruthless, hidden systems of control that governed everything, including your fate. The land you lived on, the food you ate, and the very breath you took were controlled by those with power, an elite few who held sway over your life with the flick of a hand. And so, in a world where survival was the ultimate challenge, what did it really mean to thrive? As we peel back the layers of history, we begin to see that it wasn't always about brute strength, but about understanding the secrets of the world, and sometimes, those secrets were the only thing that kept you alive. For most of history, survival was not something written down in grand tomes, or proclaimed from castles perched high above the land. No, the true knowledge of how to endure came from the mouths of those who had nothing to boast, of peasants, wanderers, and those who lived on the edge of society, hidden from the eyes of kings and nobles. Their stories were never told in the halls of power, but passed quietly from one generation to the next in whispered words, shared around humble fires in the dead of night. These were the forgotten heroes, the ones who, through sheer necessity, learned to thrive in a world that was anything but forgiving. Survival in the medieval world demanded more than basic farming and hunting skills. It demanded ingenuity, adaptability, and a connection to a deeper understanding of the world around them. Imagine a life where each day could be your last, where your survival hinged not only on your ability to till the soil or hunt for food, but on your understanding of the herbs that grew in the woods, the hidden springs of fresh water, or the ways to protect your crops from pests and disease. This knowledge was passed on not in books, but through stories, experience, and often a deep sense of intuition, skills developed in the face of relentless hardship, and sometimes hidden from the watchful eyes of those in charge. Herbal medicine was one such skill. The common folk knew how to treat wounds, illnesses, and fevers, with the natural resources around them, plants, roots, and flowers. But the use of these remedies was often misunderstood, or even vilified by those in power. What if, in the medieval world, the most effective cures and treatments were actually known by those who had no formal education, the ones deemed unlearned? In truth, many of the herbal remedies that have resurfaced in modern alternative medicine were first discovered in the forests and fields, passed down through oral traditions, dismissed by elites, and branded as witchcraft or heresy. These were methods that saved lives, yet history buried them under the weight of superstition and fear. Beyond medicine, the common people were masters of self-reliance. They built their own homes, tamed wild animals, and knew the secret paths through forests that could lead them to safety or new land. The very craft of survival was rooted in their ability to adapt to the changing seasons and the ever-present threats of famine, disease, and conflict. Imagine being a peasant in the medieval world, where every aspect of your survival, your shelter, your food, your health, depended on your own hands and the wisdom passed down by those who came before you. If you didn't know how to craft your own tools, protect your harvest, or tend to your wounds, you had little chance of surviving. But even more than just the known skills, there were the secrets that were rarely spoken about, but whispered in moments of desperation. Perhaps it was the art of food preservation, long before the days of refrigeration, using methods that seemed almost magical to outsiders: fermentation, drying, and salting. Or perhaps it was knowledge of the land itself, techniques of crop rotation and soil treatment that allowed some to thrive while others starved. These hidden skills could have changed the course of history, had they been embraced and spread more widely. Instead, they were relegated to the fringes, often kept in the shadows for fear of drawing attention. And in the midst of this hidden world of survival, there were those who knew of even deeper, darker knowledge. Forbidden techniques that were passed only in secret, sometimes within the confines of the night, out of sight of authorities who feared them. These were the whispers of the common folk, the ones who understood the power of the land, the herbs, and the unseen forces that governed survival. What if these forgotten skills, passed down in hushed tones, held the key not only to physical survival, but to the survival of a spirit that could endure anything the world threw at it? What if the real survival techniques of the medieval world were not those handed down through the privileged classes, but those carried by the hands of the forgotten, the oppressed, and the hidden? The medieval world was a place where survival was deeply intertwined with power. For most people, the struggle to live was not just a matter of planting crops or mending clothes. It was about navigating a world where every facet of life, from the land beneath your feet to the air you breathed, was controlled by forces far beyond your reach. It was a world of feudal systems, where land, your very means of survival, was owned and controlled by a powerful few. The nobility and the church were the true rulers, the ones who held sway over the lives of peasants, merchants, and serfs. They dictated what people could and could not do, where they could go, and how they would live. In this rigid hierarchy, survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was political, a constant negotiation with the very systems that determined your place in society. If you were born a peasant, your fate was largely sealed before you even took your first breath. You were bound to the land, tied to it by invisible chains. Your survival depended on the whims of the noble family that owned the estate where you worked. You lived at their mercy, subject to their demands for labor, taxes, and obedience. Your livelihood could be taken away in an instant if the Lord decided to raise the rent or seize the crops. Life wasn't just precarious, it was unpredictable, shaped by the whims of those with power. But even in this harsh world, the elites who controlled everything were not immune to the forces that shaped survival. The nobility's wealth was tied to the land, and though they lived in relative comfort, Their power could be threatened by forces beyond their control: war, famine, and the sudden collapse of their own societies. The church, too, played a central role in maintaining the status quo, wielding immense power over both the living and the dead. While the church promised salvation and divine protection, it also reinforced the structures that kept the peasants in their place. The clergy's control over religious life, coupled with the church's role in governing morality, ensured that people accepted their fate without question, surrendering to a belief that their suffering was a divine test. What if the true nature of survival in medieval times wasn't about the strongest living, but about who controlled the land, and who could dictate whether you even had a chance at survival? The truth is, the power dynamics of the time ensured that survival wasn't simply an individual struggle. It was a collective experience, shaped by the unequal distribution of wealth, land, and influence. The people who lived on the edges of this system, the common folk, had to fight not just for food and shelter, but for autonomy in a world that constantly sought to control them. The concept of serfdom, a form of bondage where peasants were tied to the land they worked, is an example of this political control. Serfs were not free, they could not leave the land without permission, and their labor was not just their livelihood, it was their only hope for survival. Every day, the power structure shaped their existence, dictating what they could grow, where they could go, and even how much of their harvest they could keep. The laws of the land were not in the hands of the people, but of those who ruled over them. Survival in this system was less about skill or resourcefulness, and more about submission and compliance. The true test was not merely how well one could survive, but how well one could endure the crushing weight of this hierarchy. And in this world, rebellion was always in the air. As the common people grew more aware of their exploitation, they began to question the very systems that kept them under control. But the cost of rebellion was high. What hope did a peasant have against the armored knights of a noble lord? Yet, even within the rigid structure of feudal society, moments of defiance flickered. There were uprisings, revolts, and whispers of change, though many were brutally crushed before they could take hold. Still, the very fact that these ideas existed, the idea that survival could be fought for, not just endured, remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The medieval world was one of constant uncertainty. Life was governed not just by the seasons, but by the ever-present fear of what came after them: hunger. Famine was the spectre that loomed over every harvest, casting a shadow over the hope of bounty. When crops failed, or the weather turned cruel, survival became a matter of stretching food resources as far as possible. But even with careful planning, there was no guarantee. The line between life and death could be as thin as the last scraps of grain left in the granary. Imagine waking up each day knowing that the food on your table could be the last meal you'd see for weeks, if not months. When famine struck, there was no supermarket to turn to, no aid coming in from outside. Instead, people had to turn to whatever they could find. In times of extreme hunger, the line between food and inedible blurred. Foraging for roots, berries, and wild plants was the first step, but many would have to go further, relying on anything that could provide sustenance. Insects became a valuable source of protein, and some even resorted to eating animals they would normally avoid. But what was even darker were the stories of those who turned to eating the dead, whether the remains of animals or, in the most desperate times, human corpses. It was a horrifying reality, one that not only tested the body but also the psyche, as people were forced to confront their deepest taboos just to stay alive. The fear of starvation was more than just a threat, it was a constant presence in medieval life. The unpredictability of the weather made crops difficult to rely on, while famine often arrived suddenly, catching people unprepared. And it wasn't just the food shortages that made survival so difficult. It was the constant cycle of deprivation, the gnawing hunger that never fully left, even when the worst was over. It was a cycle of constant fear, one that had people wondering if the next meal would be their last. What would you do if your only choice for survival was to eat what you had been taught to fear most? Would you be able to swallow your pride and everything else just to live another day? The medieval world didn't give people the luxury of choice. Survival was about adaptability, and for many, it was about doing whatever was necessary to survive, even if it meant confronting the unthinkable. In the medieval world, The very air you breathed could carry the seeds of your demise. As if life wasn't precarious enough with famine always on the horizon, there was a far more insidious threat lurking: disease. Of all the afflictions that devastated medieval populations, the plague was by far the most terrifying. It didn't announce its arrival with a storm or a famine. It struck without warning, turning vibrant cities into desolate graveyards in a matter of weeks. The most infamous of these was the Black Death, a plague that ravaged Europe in the 14th century, killing millions in its wake. The cause of the plague remained a mystery to the people of the time. With no understanding of germs, bacteria, or viruses, the people of the medieval world had no way of comprehending the invisible threat that swept through their towns and villages. Superstition ran rampant. Many believed it was a divine punishment for sin. Others blamed it on miasmas, foul airs, or even astrological alignments. It didn't matter what they believed, though. The disease struck indiscriminately, and with terrifying speed. It spread across Europe in waves, carried by fleas that lived on rats, and it left devastation in its path. Entire communities were wiped out, and survivors lived in constant fear of contracting the deadly disease. For those who survived the plague, life was marked by a profound shift. The fear of death loomed large, not just in their daily lives, but in their very bones. People stopped looking to the future, living in the present with an acute awareness of their mortality. Survival wasn't just about staying healthy, it was about finding ways to avoid the plague altogether. Some turned to quarantine, locking themselves in their homes, cutting off contact with the outside world. Others wore strange protective clothing, such as the beak masks used by doctors, stuffed with herbs they believed could ward off disease. But even these measures were often futile. Imagine living in a time where every cough, every fever, was a potential death sentence. A time where no doctor could truly help, where all you could do was wait and pray that the disease would pass over you. What if the medieval world could have survived the plagues if they only knew the truth behind the disease? If they understood how it spread and what they could do to protect themselves, would the death toll have been so high? In a world where disease was a constant and often lethal threat, the line between healing and heresy was blurred. Medicine in the medieval era was crude, based on a mixture of trial and error, superstition, and the teachings of ancient scholars. But some had knowledge that went far beyond what was officially sanctioned. These individuals, the herbalists, alchemists, and witches of the time, understood the hidden powers of nature, powers that the church and the state tried to suppress. They knew how to heal using plants, roots, and potions, but their practices were often branded as dark, dangerous, and forbidden. While the church and the authorities sought to control knowledge, many of these self-taught healers practiced in secret, passing down their knowledge through whispered words and forbidden texts. In their hands, the world of herbal medicine became a form of survival. The remedies they used, some of which would later prove effective, were often dismissed by the elites as witchcraft. But what if these healers knew something vital that the official medical practices couldn't understand? What if they held the key to surviving the deadly plagues and other diseases that ravaged Europe? The herbs, the potions, the rituals, they were dismissed not because they didn't work, but because they threatened the power structures that ruled over life and death. Many of these healers were persecuted, burned at the stake, or tortured for their knowledge. The very people who could have saved lives were silenced, cast out, and labeled as witches. Imagine a world where the remedies that could have saved countless lives were lost to fear and oppression. What if the true cure to medieval ailments was hidden in these dark arts, and not in the textbooks of the church or the royal courts? The medieval world was one defined by vulnerability. Survival wasn't just a matter of food or medicine, it was a constant battle for shelter and safety. At one end of the spectrum were the grand castles, towering fortresses that offered protection from the chaos of the outside world. To the common folk, these castles were symbols of power and luxury, housing the nobility who lived lives far removed from their own daily struggles. But what if the castles we associate with royalty were actually symbols of fear, not just luxury? These stone fortresses, designed for protection against invaders, were in many ways a manifestation of the terror that plagued the elite. The very need for such strongholds pointed to a reality where survival was uncertain and danger was constant. These castles, with their high walls and fortified gates, offered security from the ever-present threat of invasion. But while the nobility had the luxury of walls to protect them, the majority of the population lived in homes that were nothing more than fragile structures. The homes of peasants were easily destroyed in raids, vulnerable to fire, and susceptible to the harsh elements. Survival within these homes was not just a matter of physical endurance, but also a matter of proximity to the violence and uncertainty that plagued medieval life. For the peasants, the concept of safety was fleeting. They could be at the mercy of both nature and man, without the protection of stone walls or the wealth to hire armed guards. Their homes were simple, often little more than mud huts or wooden shacks, easily ravaged by storms or raids. A strong wind could tear down a roof, and a single invader could reduce an entire village to rubble. In this world, security was a privilege that few could afford. For the majority, safety was an illusion that could vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving them vulnerable and exposed. The divide between the living conditions of the nobility and the common people was not just a physical one, it was a reflection of the power dynamics that shaped survival itself. The wealthy lived within walls, while the poor lived on the edge of constant danger. Safety was not a given, it was a rare and fleeting gift, often granted only to those with the power to protect it. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just a matter of getting through a hard winter or enduring a bad harvest. It was about constantly preparing for war, for invasion, and for the possibility that at any moment, an army might appear on the horizon. The world of medieval warfare was one where kingdoms were constantly in flux, where allegiances shifted, and where the threat of invasion was an ever-present reality. For the common people, this constant state of alert meant that survival was defined not just by what you could grow or build, but by how well you could defend yourself when the enemy arrived. Imagine a life where the walls of your home, if you were lucky enough to have one, were never enough to protect you, where even the peace of the night was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the sound of marching feet or the clash of swords. Survival wasn't just about keeping warm or finding food. It was about making sure your home, your family, and your life could endure the relentless threat of war. Could you imagine a life where the enemy could show up at any moment, and survival depended on whether your walls were high enough? The tension was always there, the feeling that danger could strike at any moment. And when it did, everything could be lost in an instant. Castles were built to withstand siege warfare, their high walls and moats offering some measure of protection. But for the majority of the population, this kind of defense wasn't possible. Villages were often little more than clusters of homes huddled together for protection. When invaders struck, there was no wall to keep them out. Raids could come at any time, and the peasants had few ways to defend themselves. It was a world where survival depended on knowing how to hide, how to flee, or how to fight. But often, none of those options were enough. The use of mercenaries, hired soldiers who fought for whoever could pay them, became a common practice during these times of unrest. Survival was often determined by the size of your purse and the strength of your allies. A small village might be forced to hire mercenaries to protect it from a marauding army, but the cost of such protection could be too much for the community to bear. For many, survival meant submitting to whatever force was in charge at the time, whether that was a noble lord, a mercenary army, or a conquering king. But even these defenses weren't foolproof. The threat of invasion was unpredictable, and the protection that castles and walls provided was often temporary. A siege could last months, and food stores could run out. When the walls fell, the people inside were often left at the mercy of their attackers. In a world defined by war, survival became a precarious thing, built on the shifting sands of power, strength, and fortune. As war and conflict ravaged the medieval world, the very structures that had once defined society began to weaken. The feudal system, which had placed power in the hands of the nobility, was now under siege from both external threats and internal strife. The common folk, who had long been subjugated to the will of the aristocracy, began to see their opportunity. In times of social upheaval, when the old systems of power began to collapse, new forms of rebellion emerged. Rebellions led by those who had once been invisible, the peasants, the serfs, and the laborers. The rise of the common man in medieval times was not an overnight event. It was the result of centuries of frustration, hardship, and resistance. As kingdoms were weakened by war, plagues, and famine, the stability that had once kept the noble classes in power began to erode. Peasants, once bound by the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism, began to see their chance. Rebellions, uprisings, and revolts started to spread across Europe as the lower classes fought back against the oppressive system that had kept them in servitude for so long. But even more than just rebellion, the rise of the common man came in the form of economic change. The growing importance of trade and the emergence of early merchant classes began to offer new opportunities for those who had once been tied to the land. Cities, which had once been the domain of the wealthy and the powerful, began to attract more and more people from rural areas. These urban centers became hubs of survival, where those who had no land or title could still carve out a new life. For the first time in history, social mobility, however limited, was a possibility. The world was beginning to shift, and the common man was beginning to rise from the shadows. What if the real survivors of the medieval world weren't the kings and knights, but the people who fought back from the shadows? What if the true strength of the medieval world lay not in the castles or armies of the rich, but in the resilience of the common people who, in the face of all odds, found ways to survive, to rebel, and to reshape society? The rise of the common man didn't just change the social order, it changed the very nature of survival. The people who had once been nothing more than pawns in the game of the powerful were now taking control of their destinies. They weren't simply surviving, they were becoming the architects of a new world. In the shadows of medieval history lies a secret world, one filled with knowledge that was deliberately kept from the masses. While the church and the state preached salvation, there were others, hidden scholars, mystics, and alchemists, who possessed knowledge far beyond what was officially sanctioned. These texts, teachings, and practices were not just mystical, they had practical, often life-saving applications in times of plague, war, and famine. But how much of this knowledge was erased, buried, or kept hidden from those who could have used it to survive? In medieval times, much of the wisdom that could have empowered the people was relegated to forbidden texts, books written in codes, or hidden from the public eye. The Gnostics, for example, held teachings that emphasized secret knowledge about the universe, and many early occult traditions delved into concepts of healing, self-preservation, and spiritual endurance. These traditions didn't just offer mystical insight, they were rooted in practical knowledge that could help one survive when society itself was teetering on the brink of collapse. These were the kinds of teachings that the church deemed dangerous ideas that could undermine its authority by giving the people the power to heal themselves, to understand the world around them, and perhaps even to challenge the established order. Did the secret knowledge that could have saved lives in the medieval world get buried, erased, or hidden from us forever? The truth is, much of this knowledge has been lost to history, suppressed by those in power who feared its potential to disrupt the status quo. Alchemy, with its roots in both spiritual and practical pursuits, could have provided insights into medicine, chemistry, and even nutrition that could have alleviated suffering during plagues or famine. And yet, most of what was written in these hidden texts was condemned as heresy. The secrecy surrounding these practices didn't just affect the common people. Even the elite, those who were supposed to be the gatekeepers of knowledge, were kept in the dark. What if the forbidden knowledge that could have transformed the course of medieval survival was suppressed, buried, or kept hidden, simply because it challenged the very institutions that controlled life and death? In medieval Europe, knowledge was power. But what happens when the institution that holds that power decides what you can and cannot know? The church, wielding unparalleled control over both spiritual and intellectual life, played a central role in shaping what was considered acceptable knowledge. It was not just a spiritual authority, it was a political and intellectual one, shaping every facet of life from the birth of a child to their death. And as the guardian of truth, the church worked tirelessly to control the flow of knowledge, especially anything that threatened its doctrine. The church's censorship extended far beyond theological teachings. The very knowledge that could have helped people survive the harshest conditions during plagues, famines, and wars was often suppressed because it contradicted church teachings. Mystical texts, alchemy, and herbal remedies were seen as dangerous. Those who practiced such knowledge, the so-called witches and heretics were often labeled enemies of the church, burned at the stake, or tortured into confessing false crimes. What was their crime? Knowledge that could empower the common people to heal themselves, to protect their homes, and to survive in a world where the church's teachings were not enough. At its core, the church's power over knowledge wasn't just about religion, it was about maintaining control. If the masses could heal themselves, if they could understand the world through their own lens, and not through the distorted views of the church, the very foundation of the church's authority would crumble. The church's monopoly on knowledge was absolute, and anything that threatened that monopoly had to be eradicated. Was the church really protecting souls, or were they keeping people in the dark to maintain control over their survival? This battle over knowledge wasn't limited to the common people. Even within the church itself, there were those who secretly held forbidden knowledge. Some members of the clergy were rumored to possess alchemical texts and medicinal knowledge passed down through secret channels. These clandestine practices weren't just about mysticism, they were about survival, about using hidden knowledge to navigate a world rife with threats. The church, despite its public stance, was often deeply involved in the very practices it sought to suppress. By controlling knowledge, the church ensured that its influence stretched beyond the pews and into every aspect of life. But what if this control wasn't just about religion or power over souls? What if it was about controlling the very survival of the people, limiting what they could do to protect themselves, to heal, and to fight back against the dangers that threatened their lives? Beneath the surface of medieval society, in the dark corners of castles and monasteries, and in the hidden meetings of secret societies, there was a world that few were ever meant to see. These secret societies, often shrouded in mysticism and occult practices, were the keepers of forbidden knowledge, knowledge that could have not only changed the course of medieval survival, but that continues to haunt our understanding of history to this day. One such group, the Knights Templar, has fascinated historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Though often thought of as a group of religious warriors, their true power extended beyond the battlefield. The Templars were believed to possess knowledge that was far older than Christianity, knowledge that may have included ancient texts, alchemical secrets, and even artifacts lost to time. It is said that the Templars guarded these treasures zealously, passing them down through secretive means. But what were these treasures, and why were they so fiercely protected? What if the most powerful conspiracies of the medieval world were not just about gold or power, but about knowledge that could change everything we think we know? The Templars weren't just fighting wars, they were fighting to control knowledge that had the potential to reshape society. They weren't just guarding treasure, they were guarding survival. Similarly, the Rosicrucians, another secret society, are thought to have possessed ancient mystical wisdom that spanned both the physical and spiritual worlds. Their teachings included alchemical and herbal knowledge that could have offered powerful survival strategies in times of plague or famine. This hidden knowledge didn't just benefit the elite, it could have saved countless lives if it had been widely known. But like the Templars, the Rosicrucians were part of a secret tradition, one that the church and monarchy sought to destroy. They understood the power of hidden knowledge, the kind that could challenge the established order, and they knew that survival was a matter of holding on to that knowledge at any cost. These secret societies weren't just about mysticism, they were about maintaining control over resources that were essential to survival, like ancient texts, medicinal knowledge, and even weapons of war. The church and monarchy may have controlled the outward aspects of society, but these hidden groups controlled the undercurrent, the flow of knowledge that could have shaped the future. What if these hidden conspiracies influenced not only medieval survival, but also the course of history? What if they shaped not only the medieval world, but the very world we live in today, in ways we don't yet fully understand? The legacy of these groups, their knowledge, and their survival strategies still linger in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. In the face of harsh realities, war, famine, disease, the people of the medieval world learned to survive using methods that, while born out of necessity, have persisted throughout history. Some of these techniques, seemingly simple but profoundly effective, have shaped the survival strategies we rely on today, though many of us may not even realize their medieval origins. From basic food preservation to the foundations of herbal medicine, The survival practices developed in the dark times of the Middle Ages are now woven into the fabric of our modern lives. What if the survival techniques we take for granted today were actually born in the darkest, most dangerous times of history? Medieval people were forced to adapt to the most brutal conditions: an unstable climate, frequent invasions, the constant threat of disease, and the scarcity of resources. To make it through, they created techniques that are surprisingly similar to the ones many of us use today. The practice of fermenting and pickling food, for example, was essential in a world without refrigeration. It not only allowed people to preserve food during lean times, but it also contributed to better nutrition. The same techniques we now rely on to preserve fruits, vegetables, and even meats have their roots in medieval necessity. Similarly, herbal medicine, which has seen a resurgence in modern times, was born out of the desperate need to survive when conventional medicine failed. Medieval healers learned to harness the power of local plants to treat wounds, illnesses, and infections. Many of the remedies we use today, such as using garlic for its antibiotic properties, or the soothing effects of chamomile, can trace their origins back to medieval healing practices that were passed down through generations. Even basic architecture, such as the use of thick stone walls to keep homes warm in winter and cool in summer, has roots in medieval building techniques. While technology has advanced, the need for homes that offer protection against the elements, using locally available materials, still echoes in modern sustainable living practices. The medieval world was built on a foundation of survival knowledge, born of necessity, and honed by generations living in constant fear of the unknown. And though many of these practices were passed down in whispers, their influence continues to resonate today. The connection between the past and the present is clearer than we might think. As the modern world faces its own set of challenges, climate change, societal instability, and growing concerns about the future, the survival strategies once forged in the medieval crucible are being rediscovered and embraced by a new generation. The medieval past, long relegated to history books and forgotten lore, is now emerging as a source of inspiration for those seeking to reclaim self-sufficiency and resilience in an increasingly unpredictable world. What if the ancient survival techniques of the medieval world could be the key to surviving today's uncertain future? The rise of the modern prepper movement, homesteading, and a return to self-sufficiency are all manifestations of a collective desire to reconnect with the basics of survival. As people begin to question the reliability of modern systems, food supply chains, healthcare, and energy grids, many are turning back to medieval wisdom to ensure they can weather the storms ahead. Foraging for food, preserving harvests, and growing medicinal herbs in one's own backyard are all practices that once helped people survive in the Middle Ages. Today, these same practices are experiencing a revival, often embraced by individuals seeking independence and a more sustainable way of life. Herbal remedies, long dismissed by modern medicine, are also gaining renewed attention. With a growing awareness of the dangers of pharmaceutical dependence, more people are learning to identify and use plants that have been used for centuries to treat ailments. This return to medieval healing practices is not just about nostalgia, it's about practicality. These remedies, though simple, can be incredibly effective, and the knowledge of their use was often passed down through generations in the most obscure corners of medieval society. Food preservation techniques like fermenting, salting, and smoking are also making a comeback. As climate change leads to unpredictable harvests and the world faces increasing supply chain disruptions, these age-old methods of food storage have never been more valuable. Medieval people relied on these techniques to survive long winters and times of scarcity, and today, they offer us a way to preserve our food without the need for refrigeration or industrial processes. Moreover, the ancient art of building shelters using natural materials is another rediscovered skill. From cob houses to straw bale homes, these techniques have gained popularity in the quest for sustainability and resilience. Medieval builders had to make do with what they had on hand, using local materials and time-honored methods to create structures that could withstand the harshest elements. In a world that faces natural disasters, rising energy costs, and environmental degradation, these practices offer not just a connection to the past, but a blueprint for the future. Today's survivalists are looking to the medieval world, not just for knowledge, but for solutions to the challenges of our time. The knowledge of how to live with the land, how to protect oneself from harm, and how to adapt to changing circumstances is more relevant than ever. In a world where modern systems may fail or falter, it is the ancient survival techniques of the medieval world that may prove to be the key to ensuring our survival in the years to come. While the medieval world is often seen as a time of superstition and ignorance, it was also a time of experimentation and discovery. The seeds of many modern advances, particularly in the fields of medicine, architecture, and engineering, were planted in the shadowy world of medieval alchemy, herbalism, and craftsmanship. These seemingly arcane pursuits, often dismissed as primitive or even heretical, laid the foundation for the innovations that have shaped our modern world. Medieval alchemy, for instance, was not just about turning base metals into gold. At its core, alchemy was an attempt to understand the fundamental nature of matter and the processes of transformation. While many of the mystical aspects of alchemy have been discarded, its influence on modern chemistry is undeniable. The alchemists' experiments with substances and their pursuit of the philosopher's stone paved the way for the scientific methods that would later lead to the discovery of essential elements, the development of pharmaceuticals, and the creation of modern medical treatments. Similarly, medieval medicine, though rudimentary by today's standards, laid the groundwork for many of the medical advances that followed. Medieval physicians, often working with limited knowledge and resources, began to record their findings and pass them down through generations. They experimented with herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and anatomical studies, many of which would later be refined and expanded upon by later generations of scientists and doctors. The use of plants for medicinal purposes, which has seen a resurgence in modern times, has roots that go deep into medieval practices. In the realm of architecture and engineering, medieval builders created structures that still stand today, cathedrals, castles, and bridges that have defied the ravages of time. The techniques they used, often honed through trial and error, laid the foundation for many modern construction practices. The use of arches and buttresses, for example, not only made medieval cathedrals possible, but became a cornerstone of later architectural innovations. These methods, born from necessity, allowed medieval builders to create monumental structures that could withstand the test of time. Medieval engineering also influenced the development of military technologies, from siege weapons to fortifications. The principles of defense and protection that governed castle design and the construction of walls and moats have been adapted into modern military strategies and infrastructure. The focus on security, both for the individual and the community, was a central part of medieval survival, and many of these principles continue to shape modern defense tactics today. What if the roots of today's greatest technological and medical advances were planted in the medieval world's darkest corners? The discoveries made during the Middle Ages may have been overshadowed by superstition and political control, but their legacy lives on in the technologies we depend on today. The medieval world, often seen as backward or primitive, was actually a crucible of experimentation, where the foundations for many of our modern survival strategies were first forged. In a world where uncertainty looms large, whether due to climate change, economic instability, or global conflict, the modern prepper movement is gaining momentum. Today's survivalists are looking back to the past for inspiration, and the medieval world, with its constant battles for survival, has become a rich source of knowledge. From food preservation to building self-sufficient homesteads, many of the strategies medieval peasants used to endure their harsh realities are now being adopted by those preparing for a less predictable future. Much like their medieval ancestors, modern preppers are learning to rely on themselves, minimizing their dependence on fragile infrastructure. The practice of preserving food, a vital skill in the Middle Ages when famines were frequent, is now making a comeback. Preppers are returning to the methods of salting, smoking, fermenting, and canning, all techniques once perfected by medieval communities who needed to survive long, harsh winters when fresh food was scarce. The importance of self-reliance, so essential to medieval survival, has become a central principle of the modern prepper philosophy. Water purification is another area where medieval survival tactics are being revisited. In medieval times, people relied on natural water sources, often boiling water or using rudimentary filtration methods to ensure it was drinkable. Today's preppers are returning to these simple methods as they seek ways to secure safe water when modern plumbing systems may fail. These techniques, once born out of necessity, are becoming part of the modern survival toolkit. Defending one's homestead has also become a focus for today's preppers. In medieval times, castles and fortified homes served as protection against invaders and raiders. While castles may no longer be a practical solution, the principles of defending one's territory and ensuring personal safety are alive and well. Whether through the use of fences, gates, or even more sophisticated surveillance systems, modern preppers are embracing the medieval mindset of protecting what's theirs, knowing that when things go wrong, security can make the difference between life and death. Are we repeating the medieval world's darkest lessons, or are we learning from them to survive in a collapsing world? The line between the past and present is thinner than we might think. The medieval world, often seen as a time of fear and ignorance, can teach us lessons in self-reliance and resilience that have never been more relevant. Technology has undoubtedly made our lives easier, but it has also made us increasingly vulnerable. As we become more reliant on the conveniences of modern life, smartphones, internet connectivity, electricity, we have become disconnected from the very skills that allowed our ancestors to survive. Modern infrastructure is fragile, and the digital systems, power grids, and supply chains that we rely on are more vulnerable than we care to admit. In times of crisis, be it a natural disaster, an economic collapse, or an unforeseen technological failure, our dependence on technology could be our greatest weakness. While medieval survivalists didn't have the comforts of modern technology, they had something far more valuable: the ability to adapt and rely on themselves. Medieval people lived in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where famine, disease, and invasion were constant threats. They learned to make do with what they had. Food preservation was a matter of life and death. The techniques medieval people developed, such as drying, fermenting, and pickling, ensured that they could endure long winters or periods of scarcity. These methods didn't rely on refrigeration or complex machinery. Instead, they were simple, effective, and sustainable. Today, we see a resurgence in interest in these age-old methods of food preservation, particularly among preppers and homesteaders. The same skills that medieval people relied on are now being reimagined for modern use, as people seek ways to feed themselves and their families in uncertain times. Similarly, medieval people were resourceful in medicine. Without access to modern pharmaceuticals, they turned to nature. Herbal remedies, which were once dismissed as primitive, are now being embraced by modern survivalists and alternative medicine advocates. Today, we see a renewed interest in using plants and herbs for healing, a practice that was central to medieval survival. These plants were often the difference between life and death, offering remedies for everything from infections to wounds. In fact, many of the herbs used in medieval medicine are still considered effective in modern natural healing today. The fragility of modern technology has become painfully clear in recent years. Power outages, digital breaches, and supply chain disruptions are becoming more frequent, leaving people to realize that the modern world's dependence on technology could be a double-edged sword. What if the greatest threat to modern survival isn't natural disaster, but our blind faith in technology? What if the systems we've built to make life easier are actually setting us up for failure when they break down? In times of crisis, when the power goes out or the internet stops working, how prepared are we to survive? Perhaps, in this modern age of convenience and innovation, it's time to look back. The ancient techniques of the medieval world, though simple, are still viable. The adaptability and self-sufficiency of the medieval survivors can teach us how to thrive in an uncertain world, where modern technology might fail us when we need it most. Surviving the challenges of the medieval world required more than just knowledge of food preservation or herbal remedies. It required a mindset, a way of thinking that prepared people for whatever the world could throw at them. Medieval survivalists didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences, and yet they endured, often by cultivating an unshakable resilience, adaptability, and resourcefulness. These mental qualities were their most valuable tools, and they are just as important for survival today. In the medieval world, survival was not guaranteed. Every day brought new challenges: harsh weather, plagues, invasions, and famine. People didn't just survive based on what they knew, they survived based on how they responded to adversity. Self-reliance was key. In an age where help wasn't readily available, individuals had to depend on their own resourcefulness. This is a lesson that modern survivalists are learning again today. We may have access to modern technology, but in times of crisis, when everything breaks down, it is the ability to adapt and think critically that will determine survival. Adaptability was also crucial. Medieval survivalists didn't have the luxury of clinging to old methods when circumstances changed. The climate could shift, crops could fail, and new threats could emerge. In these times, survival meant the ability to change with the times. Today's world is no different. As we face climate change, economic instability, and the potential for societal collapse, we must be prepared to adapt to new circumstances, just as our medieval ancestors did. Perhaps one of the most important lessons from the medieval world is the importance of community. While individual survival skills were vital, medieval people also relied on their communities for support. Whether it was a small village or a large city, people understood that their survival depended on cooperation. The medieval world was harsh, but the shared responsibility for survival created bonds that allowed communities to endure even the most challenging times. How do you survive when everything seems against you? The medieval world has a secret for those willing to learn. It's not just about knowing the right skills, it's about developing the mental strength to face any challenge, adapt to changing circumstances, and rely on the support of others when the world becomes uncertain. These lessons, drawn from the struggles of the medieval past, can help us build a survivalist mindset that will carry us through the challenges of the modern world. The lessons of medieval survival were never truly lost. They have simply evolved and endured, tucked away in the traditions, practices, and cultures of communities around the world. In fact, many ancient survival techniques that once helped medieval people endure harsh winters, ravaging plagues, and constant warfare are still practiced today, albeit in modified forms. From communal farming practices to sustainable living, these methods are alive and well, shaping the way people live and thrive in today's uncertain world. What if the medieval survival secrets we thought were lost are still alive today, hidden in plain sight around the world? In rural communities across the globe, ancient methods of food preservation, resource management, and craftsmanship continue to be the backbone of daily life. The art of preserving food through salting, drying, and fermenting, once essential for survival during long winters, is now a vital practice for those seeking self-sufficiency. In parts of Europe and the Americas, the medieval practice of communal farming, where neighbors come together to grow and share crops, continues to thrive, ensuring that local communities have a steady supply of food, even in times of crisis. These practices not only sustain people in the face of modern challenges, but also maintain the sense of solidarity and cooperation that was essential to medieval survival. The wisdom of ancient builders is still evident in modern forms of sustainable architecture. Just as medieval craftsmen learned to use local materials to construct homes that could withstand the elements, contemporary architects are turning to time-tested methods of construction to build energy-efficient, durable homes. Whether it's the use of thick walls to insulate homes, or natural building techniques like cob and straw bale construction, the medieval ingenuity for creating shelter that blends with the environment is experiencing a modern revival. Around the world, communities continue to honor the resilience and resourcefulness of their medieval ancestors. From the communal survival strategies in remote farming villages to the preservation of traditional craftsmanship, medieval survival methods have not only survived but adapted, thriving in modern cultures across continents. The medieval world, often seen as backward or primitive, was, in reality, a crucible of ingenuity, where necessity truly became the mother of invention. Many of the survival techniques developed during this time laid the groundwork for modern technologies, even though we may not always recognize their origins. What if the cutting-edge technology we rely on today was actually inspired by the ingenuity of medieval survivalists? Take, for example, the development of fortifications and siege engineering. Medieval builders created some of the most awe-inspiring structures in history, from towering castles to fortified city walls. These structures were designed not only for defense but for survival. The principles of castle design, thick stone walls, strategic towers, and moats, are still seen in modern architecture, particularly in the design of secure government buildings, military bases, and high-rise apartments. The focus on durability and defense during the medieval period has evolved into our modern obsession with security and building resilience against natural and man-made disasters. The preservation methods used by medieval people also influenced modern innovations. For centuries, communities relied on salt, drying, fermentation, and pickling to ensure food could last through the leanest months. These techniques not only helped people survive the winter months, but paved the way for the development of modern refrigeration and food storage systems. In fact, much of the food preservation knowledge from medieval times was adapted and refined during the Industrial Revolution, leading to the canning process and eventually modern cold storage facilities that keep our global food supply chain functioning today. Even the basics of water purification can be traced back to medieval survival practices. The need to filter water during the Middle Ages led to the invention of rudimentary filtration systems. Early medieval engineers used simple methods, like boiling water, adding herbs, or even using sand and charcoal to purify water. These primitive techniques laid the foundation for the modern water purification systems we rely on today, from home filtration devices to large-scale municipal water treatment facilities. Medieval medicine, while often misunderstood, also had lasting effects on modern healthcare. Though much of it was based on superstition and trial and error, medieval healers made discoveries in herbalism, wound care, and surgery that would later influence the development of modern pharmaceuticals and medical practices. Many of the plants used for healing in medieval times, such as echinacea, willow bark, and peppermint, are still used in modern medicine and alternative therapies today. The medieval obsession with finding cures for common ailments was the precursor to the scientific inquiries that would later give rise to the modern pharmaceutical industry. In many ways, the survival strategies of the medieval world were not just a response to crisis, but a form of innovation that paved the way for modern technologies. These ancient techniques, born out of desperation and necessity, were transformed into the foundation for much of what we take for granted in the modern world. The survival strategies of medieval people weren't just about food and shelter. They were also about how societies organized themselves to ensure long-term survival. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy, was the foundation of medieval society. But beyond its often brutal social structure, the medieval system of governance was built on a pragmatic understanding of survival. Land was the key to survival, and control over land meant control over life. The medieval world, with its constant threats from external forces and its internal struggles for power, required a sophisticated system to manage resources, labor, and defense. What if the way our societies are organized today is still rooted in the survival tactics of medieval kingdoms? In medieval times, power was decentralized. Lords, vassals, and serfs each played a role in ensuring the survival of the kingdom. The land, its cultivation, and its defense were shared responsibilities. Communities had to cooperate to survive, just as they had to defend against invaders and manage scarce resources. These ideas of shared responsibility and hierarchical structures influenced the development of modern political systems, particularly in terms of resource allocation and social welfare. The feudal system may seem like a distant, outdated relic, but its influence can still be seen in modern society. The structure of modern governments, with elected officials serving the people and managing resources, can trace its roots back to medieval feudalism, albeit in a much more evolved form. The concept of providing protection in exchange for loyalty and the role of governments in managing the welfare of their citizens can be traced directly to these medieval systems. Beyond politics, medieval survival also had a significant impact on the evolution of law. The medieval world saw the emergence of codified laws and the legal framework that would later become the foundation for modern legal systems. These laws were designed not only to govern, but to ensure the survival of the community in the face of internal and external threats. The emphasis on justice, land rights, and the protection of property in medieval societies has evolved into the modern concepts of civil rights, property laws, and even international diplomacy. While the medieval world was often a brutal and inequitable place, it laid the groundwork for the systems of governance that continue to shape our world. The lessons learned from medieval survival, how to allocate resources, manage communities, and defend against threats, are still embedded in the political structures of today. The medieval world was one of hardship and uncertainty, a time when survival was often a battle against the forces of nature, disease, and violence. In such an environment, stories were not just a form of entertainment. They were tools for survival, passed down through generations, as both lessons and warnings. What if the medieval legends we think are just fairy tales were actually survival manuals disguised as stories? These myths and folklore often contained hidden lessons about resilience, resourcefulness, and human endurance, critical qualities necessary for surviving in such a brutal world. In a time when books were scarce and education limited, the oral tradition was essential for passing down knowledge. Stories about knights embarking on quests or heroes overcoming impossible odds were more than just tales of bravery. They were stories that taught the value of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. The stories of the Arthurian knights, for example, were not only about the ideals of honor and chivalry, but also about surviving adversity, whether it was facing down a dragon or uniting a fractured kingdom. Fairy tales, too, were more than just magical escapism. They often carried deeper meanings, reflecting the struggles of the common people. The classic story of Hansel and Gretel, for instance, wasn't just about a wicked witch. It was a tale of survival, of finding food and shelter in a world where famine was a real threat. The lessons embedded in these stories were vital to survival. Never give up, trust your resourcefulness, and always look for a way out of dire situations. These tales were also a means of explaining the world. In a time when so much was beyond the control of ordinary people, these stories offered a sense of agency and hope. They taught that, while fate might be cruel, there was always a way to survive, to overcome the odds, and to emerge victorious. As much as we think of these stories as merely folklore, they were part of a larger survival strategy. They offered guidance, wisdom, and a sense of control in a world that often seemed chaotic and beyond comprehension. They were more than just tales, they were survival tools, wrapped in the comfort of myth and legend. Medieval myths and legends are far from forgotten. In fact, they are still alive in modern culture, influencing everything from literature to cinema, video games, and television. These stories, originally told around fires and passed down through the generations, have evolved over the centuries but continue to captivate audiences. From the tales of King Arthur and his knights to the chivalric quests of legendary heroes, these medieval survival narratives remain central to modern storytelling. What if the legends of King Arthur and his knights are more than just stories of chivalry? What if they hold ancient survival secrets? The Arthurian legends, in particular, continue to be reinterpreted in countless forms, from books and films to TV shows and video games. These stories, with their themes of honor, bravery, and the triumph of good over evil, resonate deeply with our modern sensibilities. But beneath the surface of these tales lies a deeper layer, their focus on survival. Arthur's knights weren't just fighting for glory. They were often battling against insurmountable odds, struggling to protect their people, their lands, and their lives. The moral lessons these stories convey, the importance of loyalty, unity, and resilience, are not just relics of a bygone era. They are principles that are still relevant today. What makes these stories endure? Why do we keep returning to the Knights of the Round Table, or the legends of Robin Hood, who fought against oppressive rulers for the common people? It's because these tales are about more than just battles and kings. They are about survival in a world fraught with danger. They represent the human struggle to overcome adversity, to band together in times of crisis, and to find hope even when faced with overwhelming odds. These themes are timeless, which is why they continue to capture the imagination of people across cultures and generations. Modern reinterpretations of these myths often focus on the survival aspect, emphasizing the resilience and determination of their protagonists. In films and television shows, we see knights and heroes fighting not just for honor, but for survival in a world where chaos reigns. These stories remind us that survival is not only about physical strength but also about moral courage, the ability to adapt, and the resolve to keep going even when everything seems lost. The enduring popularity of these medieval myths speaks to their relevance today. They remind us that survival is not just about overcoming external threats, but also about maintaining internal strength and unity. As we face our own global challenges, climate change, political instability, and the constant threat of crisis, these stories continue to inspire us to stand firm, to fight for what is right, and to never lose hope. The concept of heroism has undergone a profound transformation since the days of the medieval knight. In the medieval world, heroes were defined by their physical prowess, their loyalty to their lord, and their willingness to fight for the survival of their people. But these knights and warriors were not just figures of strength, they embodied the survival ethos of their time. From facing dragons and dark sorcery, to defending their lands from invasion, the medieval hero was a symbol of resilience and endurance. Today, we still see the echoes of these early heroes in our modern narratives. The modern superhero, often portrayed as a lone figure, battling overwhelming odds to protect society, has its roots firmly planted in medieval survival stories. Whether it's King Arthur facing the forces of darkness, or the hero of a modern action film fighting to save the world, these characters share a fundamental trait. They embody the ideals of resilience, resourcefulness, and the unyielding drive to protect others. The medieval hero fought not just for glory but for survival, and this focus on survival in the face of impossible odds is a key theme in today's superhero stories. Consider the evolution of the modern superhero from Batman to Iron Man, from Wonder Woman to Black Panther. These characters are not simply battling evil for the sake of power, they are fighting to survive and to protect others in a world that constantly threatens to destroy them. Much like the medieval knights who fought against dragons, invaders, and dark forces, modern heroes must overcome challenges that seem insurmountable. But what makes them truly heroic is their resilience, their ability to adapt to the challenges they face, and their unwavering commitment to survival in a hostile world. Medieval survival stories were not just about overcoming external threats, they were also about internal strength. Heroes like Arthur, Robin Hood, and Beowulf were defined not just by their physical strength, but by their mental fortitude, their ability to lead, and their willingness to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. Modern heroes, whether in comic books or films, still carry these traits. In fact, many of today's heroes are not just battling external villains, they are also grappling with personal demons, making difficult decisions, and confronting their own vulnerabilities. This evolution of the hero, from medieval knight to modern superhero, mirrors our own cultural understanding of survival. Survival in the medieval world was as much about the mental resilience to face adversity as it was about the physical tools to survive. The stories of medieval heroes taught their audiences that survival wasn't just about fighting, it was about staying true to one's values, adapting to change, and finding strength in community. These themes still resonate with us today, whether in the pages of a superhero comic or in the real-world battles we face in an increasingly unpredictable world. The history of survival in the medieval world is not just a tale of peasants struggling to endure harsh conditions. It's also a story of forgotten knowledge, deliberately erased by those in power. Over the centuries, many crucial survival methods used by medieval people have been suppressed, either to maintain control over resources, or simply because they didn't fit into the dominant worldview of the time. What if the real survival secrets of the medieval world were deliberately erased, kept hidden from you for centuries? Medieval survival was about much more than simply eking out an existence in a harsh and unforgiving world. It was about the knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that allowed people to survive in the face of plagues, famine, and invasion. Much of this knowledge, however, was not written down in formal texts. It was passed orally or kept within secretive circles, such as those of herbalists, alchemists, and healers. These were practices that had the potential to change the course of survival during the medieval period, yet many of them were deliberately obscured by those in power, the church, monarchs, and the wealthy elite. One such area of knowledge was herbal medicine. While some remedies were known and shared, others were shrouded in secrecy, often feared by the ruling classes because they could empower the common people to cure themselves, rather than relying on the state or religious authorities. The suppression of these methods often meant that valuable survival knowledge was lost. This wasn't just a case of ignorance, it was a calculated effort to maintain control over a population that was kept dependent on outside authorities for survival. Many conspiracy theories suggest that this knowledge was purposefully erased or hidden by the church and ruling elite to prevent the masses from gaining too much power. The idea was simple: control the flow of survival knowledge, and you control the people. But what if some of these methods have survived in hidden corners of society, waiting for the right moment to resurface? This section sets the stage for a deeper exploration into the secrets that have been buried by history, and how they're only now beginning to be rediscovered. Despite the deliberate efforts to erase much of medieval survival knowledge, some of it has endured, lingering in the shadows for centuries before re-emerging in surprising ways. These hidden truths include rediscovered texts, secretive manuscripts, and survival practices that once helped people endure the worst of medieval hardships. What if the secrets of medieval survival were hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered? The most famous example of a medieval text resurfacing in modern times is the *** Voynich manuscript, ***, a mysterious book filled with cryptic symbols and images of plants that don't appear to exist in nature. Many believe that this manuscript, believed to date back to the 15th century, contains herbal knowledge that was hidden from the public eye. Its true meaning has eluded scholars for centuries, but some speculate that it contains valuable information on healing herbs and medicinal plants, knowledge that was suppressed by those in power to maintain their monopoly on medicine. Similar texts, often encoded or encrypted to protect their knowledge, continue to be uncovered and studied. One such example is the rediscovery of ancient alchemical writings. In medieval times, alchemy wasn't just the pursuit of turning base metals into gold. It was also an exploration into the transformation of matter, and some medieval alchemists developed surprisingly advanced techniques in chemistry, medicine, and metallurgy. The knowledge they left behind was often dismissed as superstition during their time, but today, scientists are rediscovering these practices. For instance, the alchemical pursuit of the philosopher's stone, once considered purely mythical, actually involved practical experiments in chemistry and metallurgy that laid the groundwork for the modern scientific method. In the realm of survival techniques, medieval knowledge on food preservation also survived, albeit in hidden corners. Techniques like fermentation, salting, and drying, once essential for getting through winters or long periods of famine, are now being rediscovered in a modern world, seeking alternatives to industrial food preservation methods. Foraging for wild plants, using local herbs for healing, and basic forms of shelter, building these techniques, which were often passed down through oral traditions, have made a resurgence today as people seek self-sufficiency in an increasingly uncertain world. The revival of these ancient practices and texts is not just a return to the past, it's a reclaiming of knowledge that has been hidden for centuries. Today, many people are looking back to the medieval period for clues on how to survive in a world where technology and modern conveniences may fail. For centuries, the medieval period has been portrayed as a time of constant squalor and suffering. Popular myths tell of peasants living in filth, of medieval medicine being entirely ineffective, and of a society constantly on the brink of collapse. But what if the myths about medieval survival have been twisted for centuries? What if the real story is much darker than we've been told? One of the most enduring myths is the idea that medieval people lived in constant squalor, surrounded by disease and waste. While it is true that hygiene was rudimentary compared to modern standards, the reality of medieval life was much more complex. Medieval people were, in many ways, experts in survival. They understood the importance of cleanliness in food preparation and water management, using primitive but effective methods to purify water and preserve food. Far from being ignorant of sanitation, they adapted to their environment with the tools they had at their disposal. Another misconception is that medieval medicine was completely ineffective, a mere precursor to modern science. While it's true that medieval medicine was often rudimentary, it was not without merit. Herbal remedies, which are now being rediscovered in the modern world, were central to medieval medical practices. Many of the plants used by medieval healers, such as garlic, lavender, and sage, have been found to have actual medicinal properties. The use of leeches and other techniques that are now viewed as strange were, in many cases, practical solutions based on available knowledge. The idea that medieval medicine was purely superstitious overlooks the genuine attempts made by healers to understand the human body and combat disease. The role of the church in medieval society is another area often misrepresented. While the church certainly had immense control over knowledge and was responsible for suppressing some survival techniques, it was also responsible for preserving many texts and ideas that might have otherwise been lost. Monasteries were centers of learning, where scholars worked diligently to translate and copy ancient texts, many of which contained medical and agricultural knowledge that would be essential to survival. The church, in this sense, played a complex role in the survival of medieval knowledge, both as a suppressor and as a protector of information. These myths and misconceptions have been perpetuated by those in power to control the narrative of history. By presenting the medieval period as a time of ignorance and misery, those who sought to control knowledge were able to maintain their dominance. But by debunking these myths, we can gain a clearer picture of medieval survival, showing that it required more than just brute endurance. It required ingenuity, adaptation, and a deep understanding of the natural world. As the modern world faces an increasing number of challenges, climate change, economic instability, and social unrest, the survival skills of medieval people are becoming more relevant than ever. Despite the technological advancements we've made, society is more fragile than we like to admit. The systems we depend on, electricity, food supply, healthcare, are all vulnerable to disruption. In such a world, the lessons of resilience, resourcefulness, and adaptability that medieval people relied on to survive are crucial. Could the survival skills that once saved lives in the medieval world be the key to surviving the world of tomorrow? The reality is, many of the survival methods that medieval people used were not just practical, they were essential for survival in a time when life was precarious and unpredictable. In a world where we are increasingly dependent on technology and complex infrastructures, we may find that some of these medieval strategies, like growing our own food, preserving food without refrigeration, and using natural remedies, are exactly what we need to thrive in an uncertain future. Moreover, these survival strategies were deeply rooted in a relationship with the environment that has been lost in the modern world. Medieval people knew how to live off the land, how to work with nature rather than against it. In today's age, as we face the very real threat of climate change and resource depletion, these lessons are incredibly valuable. The ability to adapt, to live sustainably, and to rely on one's own resourcefulness is just as important now as it was in the Middle Ages. As we look to the future, it's clear that the lessons of medieval survival have much to offer us. We may not face the same battles that medieval people did, but the core principles of survival, self-reliance, community, and resilience are timeless and necessary. In the face of rising global uncertainty, many people are turning back to medieval methods to prepare for the future. Whether it's in response to climate change, economic instability, or societal breakdown, people are looking for sustainable, self-sufficient ways of living, much like their medieval ancestors did. The old adage, "What's old is new again," rings true when we look at how medieval survival tactics are being modernized to meet the needs of the 21st century. Take homesteading, for example. In medieval times, people were largely self-reliant, growing their own food, preserving it for winter, and making their own goods. Today, the homesteading movement is gaining momentum as people seek ways to live off the land. Urban gardens, foraging for wild edibles, and learning how to preserve food through canning, drying, and fermenting are all practices that were born in the medieval period, but are making a huge comeback today. These methods are being adapted with modern knowledge and technology, allowing individuals to grow their own food in backyards or on rooftops, and to preserve it in ways that ensure self-sufficiency. Similarly, Water purification techniques that were used in medieval times are being revisited. Medieval people understood the importance of clean water, and they developed simple filtration methods to ensure that water was safe to drink. Today, many preppers and survivalists are revisiting these age-old techniques, using natural filtration systems like sand and charcoal to purify water in times of emergency. These low-tech solutions are an alternative to reliance on potentially fragile infrastructure in modern society. The art of building shelter from the materials around you is another medieval survival tactic that is being reimagined today. Cob houses, straw bale homes, and other sustainable building techniques, often used by medieval peasants, are being embraced by those who wish to live off the grid or reduce their environmental footprint. These methods are inexpensive, sustainable, and use materials readily available in nature, making them a perfect fit for modern self-sufficiency movements. These modern adaptations of medieval survival practices offer people a way to take control of their lives and prepare for an uncertain future. By embracing the resourcefulness and ingenuity that allowed medieval people to survive, individuals today are creating resilient lifestyles that are rooted in sustainability and self-reliance. The time has come to take the lessons of medieval survival and apply them to our own lives. As we face unprecedented global challenges, from environmental degradation to political instability, building resilience is no longer optional, it's essential. The traits that allowed medieval people to survive in an unforgiving world, resilience, adaptability, and resourcefulness, are just as crucial today as they were hundreds of years ago. It's time to take action, to embrace the lessons of the past, and to build a future that is prepared for whatever comes our way. What will you do when the world shifts beneath your feet? The lessons of medieval survival hold the keys to your future. Whether it's learning to grow your own food, mastering herbal medicine, or simply understanding how to adapt to a world in flux, these skills are not just useful, they are vital. The ability to survive and thrive in the face of adversity depends on how well we adapt to changing circumstances, and the wisdom of the medieval world offers a wealth of knowledge on how to do just that. One of the most important lessons we can take from medieval survival is the value of community. In a world that is becoming more isolated, the need to build strong, supportive communities is greater than ever. Medieval people relied on each other for survival, and this sense of mutual support is something we must rediscover today. Whether it's through local farming co-ops, neighborhood watch programs, or simply being there for those in need, community is a cornerstone of resilience. Mental toughness is another crucial factor in survival, one that medieval people knew all too well. They lived through plagues, wars, and famines, and they had to develop the mental strength to endure. Today, we must cultivate that same resilience, learning to navigate uncertainty with confidence and clarity. The skills that medieval people relied on, adaptability, resourcefulness, and the ability to keep moving forward despite hardship, are the very skills we need to thrive in the modern world. The lessons from the medieval period offer a blueprint for surviving not just the physical challenges of today, but also the psychological and emotional ones. By embracing these timeless principles, we can build lives that are not only sustainable, but resilient in the face of whatever the future holds.